Dragi prijatelji, dear all, having in mind that we have international audience here, like yesterday, we will on this high noon at Museum of Revolution, Historical Museum, have our discussion and conversation with a dear friend and colleague from Ljubljana, Professor Renata Salecl. So this is day 2 of the Open University program here. And as a short introduction, though I think majority of you have been informed already about work and influence of Professor Salecl, let me just briefly inform you that basically Professor Salecl started her academic career at the Faculty of Law and the Institute of Criminology in Ljubljana, Slovenia, as a senior researcher and later on professors. Currently, she's also been appointed as a professor at the Birkbeck School of Law at University of London. It will be really quite a lot for me now to explain where else Professor Salecl has been teaching as a visiting professor or invited lecturer. But I think most importantly is to know that we are speaking about one of the most influential contemporary philosophers and sociologists. She's also, as you know, very much into the field of psychoanalysis and law, in particularly now in London, which she's really working a lot into this field. I think out of the number of the books, it's important to mention, I might be a little bit subjective, my favorite, The Spoils of Freedom. However, some of the recent publications are on anxiety, published by Routledge in 2004. Of course, important work that we will start today with is Tyranny of Choice, that has been translated as well in Serbian and Croatian, as I learned. So, of course, there is a number of other interviews, essays, chapters in edited volumes, and so on and so forth. So, Renata, if I may ask you as a starting point of our Q&A discussion, so to say, will be basically out of Tyranny of Choice. As anyone of those who have been reading the book find out that we are encouraged to view our lives as being full of choices. And last night also we had a bit of a discussion about that. And paradoxically, this freedom can create anxiety, feelings of guilt, inadequacy, and so on and so forth. So in your book, Tyranny of Choice, titled like that, you explored how the late capitalism shielded expectations of be yourself and leading to even greater disquiet. So how its insistence of the choice being a purely individual matter can prevent a social change. So Open University, in a way, start or thinking to explore these possibilities for different kinds of social changes. So I would kindly ask you, if possible, to bring your major thesis on the gains of capitalism with the prevention of the social change.
Yeah. Thank you very much, Dino. Thank you for inviting me here. Yeah, when I was working on this choice book, my first problem was, how come that, people who already wrote in the past about choice didn't think a little bit globally about the ideological setting in post-industrial capitalism, and they were pretty much looking only at the questions of, why are people so lost when they come to the shops, and there are, 100 different types of jam, and they don't know which one to choose. And so most of the research about choice has been why, if we have 10 different types of jam, we might choose one. If we have 100, we might just kind of not buy anything. And so I think that the whole theory about choice has been pretty much helping kind of capitalism so that people would consume in a better way. And then I was thinking, isn't this ideology of choice something broader than just consumer choice? Isn't it like an ideology which kind of allows the type of capitalism of today to continue in the future without people, kind of opposing it? So that's kind of, in a very simplified way, my thesis, that ideology of choice created a perfect condition for the continuation of the post-industrial capitalism, because people, first of all, are turning inwards. So ideology of choice allows this process of individualization to be pushed, further. Second, the ideology of choice, creates anxiety, feelings of guilt, the feeling of inadequacy, because we are constantly feeling that we are not choosing the right way. And also, if we believe with this ideology, which is kind of telling us that everything about our lives is in our hands, then of course, we are sort of kind of not engaging in kind of matters of social choice. We are constantly thinking only about individual choices. And what we are observing today is that this ideology has been spreading not also to the third world, so when we observe the refugees coming at our doors, they are still believers, in this ideology of choice. Everyone can make it. You have to, do the best you can. You have to move in the direction where choice is even more available. If you don't succeed, you are guilty because you haven't made the right choices. And what is also surprising is that in this ideology of choice, the remnants of sort of the ideology of rational choice, which dominated economics in the past, is still present. So in the field of economics, we have more and more the move into behavior economics, even neuroeconomics, and so on, while the sort of rational choice has been slightly kind of pushed on the side, while in the kind of a broader thinking about choice, there is still the presence that we can actually make rational choices. And my idea was that very few of our choices are kind of pure rational choices. Mostly people are choosing in regard to what other people are choosing or what is socially desirable choice. They are very much influenced by the family, by their unconscious mechanisms. Often the choices we make are kind of forced choices, and that in some way what we are forgetting when we identify with this ideology is that choice is linked to loss. That when we choose one direction of life, we lose the possibility of choosing another. And that because of this loss and kind of a negation of this loss, a denial of this loss, a lot of people today can't make any choice. And so speaking with my friends who work as psychoanalysts, especially in Great Britain, I have learned that a lot of their patients, are constantly agonizing about the simplest things in their life, or, the complicated things like having children or not, getting married or not, even the sexual identity, appears a matter of choice for some. And so these people are very paralyzed, and new symptoms in some way are emerging because of this ideology of choice. But we know from Althusser that, ideology is like a veil, which sort of gives us an illusion of obviousness. When we are caught in particular ideology, we perceive things as obvious, and, going sort of through ideology, critiquing ideology is one of the necessary kind of steps, and kind of undermining this ideology of choice that permeates our society is sort of one of the important things. And just as a kind of side remarks, in the past, I once was invited to give a talk for some businesses which are dealing with mobile phone in the Central Europe. I was quite surprised that this mobile phone, whatever association, asked me to give a talk. So I, out of curiosity, I accepted, but I thought I will, use the advertisement that they use, the mobile phone companies, to deal with this ideology, to show the ideology of choice. So I collected, advertisement for the phone companies, and most of the advertisement it's your choice, it is your voice, choose the best provider, everything is in your hands, and so on. So I collected, those advertisements, and the companies, the corporations, were outraged. They didn't allow me to use the advertisement in the lecture, which was about choice. It's your voice, whatever, without their higher echelons in the corporations reading my text before. So I was only allowed to use their advertisement in the lecture after it was approved by the boards. You know, so you can see that ideology of choice is unfortunately very much linked to the new ideas of kind of social control, even surveillance.
Absolutely. So basically, when I preparing myself, I was about to argue that if I read you correctly, being concerned with only ourselves and our own choices, in a way, we become disengaged from the politics, which is for our, so to say, context very important, but also blind to the possibility of social change. And I know that some of interventions people had you, I think it was in an interview for Spiegel or something like that, you have been asked, like, so is there a solution to have no choices at all? And I know that you, in a way, explained the paradoxes. Still, speaking about rational choice, I would just like you briefly push to try to connect it with rational choice theory applications in a specific political context, like post-transitional or post-conflict countries. I know that we have been arguing here very much with so-called interventionists from the Western Europe or United States and so on. Why and how come rational choice approach to the post-war crimes or post-conflict societies simply doesn't work? So how come that fixation on the rational choice, even in the matter of solving the very deep and post-conflict situations like in Bosnia or Iraq or any given situation?
Yeah. Thank you for these questions. Thank you.
No,
my Spiegel interview was really funny.
It is.
Yeah, it is one of the most incredible interview. Nothing kind of special as the interview, but the responses were amazing. There were like 1,000 comments on it, mostly, you know, really 50-50. 50% of people were absolutely opposed to my criticism of the ideology of choice, and mostly I have been accused that I don't understand choice because I was raised in communism. And, you know, what happened in this Spiegel interview was that East Germany and West Germany was fighting in the comments to my interview. Pretty much it was the internal crisis of their society. You know, the West accusing pretty much the East that they don't understand capitalism, right? Which is why capitalism is in crisis. And, you know, so basically the idea was that if you have been raised in capitalism, and then you understand the liberating potential of choice, otherwise you are sort of like criticizing it because you have been brainwashed in the society without choice. I have spent a lot of times in various Western countries, and I haven't seen people really, you know, understanding choice any better or being more kind of satisfied with it. And actually, we have speeded up in post-socialism to full capitalism very quickly, you know. So transitional cultures are fully integrated in all the ideologies that I'm sort of criticizing. Your second part of your question is also very important. When the collapse of socialism happened, there was a certain illusion, sometimes you know, coming from the Western sociologists or economists and so on, that post-socialist space can be like a kind of a playground for new economic or social development. So some Rawlsian theorists, for example, thought that post-socialism can be a perfect example of what Rawls describes as veil of ignorance. You know, that we can kind of start anew and create, you know, a kind of an imaginary political space about which they were kind of dreaming. Okay, already before it existed like this, that from the West, the Marxists would often look at Yugoslavia as that kind of a perfect space, you know, where their dreams of, you know, the socialist society have been realized, and especially with self-management system. And I often, you know, told them, yeah, it's nice to kind of have your dream realized in a country in which you don't live. it's kind of nice to look from abroad, comfortably in some American university, being well-paid leftist, and say what a beautiful project this Yugoslav thing is, and kind of it's a different thing living inside and dealing with the ideology, which was pretty much very much preventing social change at that time too.
Mm-hmm. So basically now it's simply recalled me that someone once said, I really apologize, cannot remember where I get it, but the definition of Yugoslav socialism were basically then transitional period from capitalism to even widest capitalism, isn't it?
Yeah.
I would about to ask you about political choices in 80s, and of course we know about your different interventions in the public space, but this Slovenian scene, if I might call it like that, and in particularly your engagement in different ways, including the running for the parliament and so on, is quite interesting. How about making a political choices at that time?
Yeah, I think that the best time was actually just before the collapse of socialism, at least in Slovenia. 80s were, times when theory was booming, criticism of the party was on all levels high. Slovenian communists were even, debating with the oppositional members, even the former president Milan Kučan, who was in the past the leader of the Communist Party. I remember invited some of the oppositional intellectuals to his office, asking them, what do you really want when you are writing in the newspapers against us? And the oppositional intellectuals said, you have to step down from the, power. And he said, yeah, that's not a bad idea. We will think about it, So there were times where, of course, there was danger for intellectuals at some point that maybe the party, will start imprisoning them. But happily, this didn't happen, which is why the Times, really kind of opened the space for a lot of debates, social critiques, a lot of theoretical interventions, and so on. When the collapse of socialism happened, when we had this short war, unfortunately, after that, things changed in the direction which isn't so progressive, especially the government run by Janez Janša and, various other kind of right-wing politicians sort of prevented kind of the country to move more into the direction of a kind of progressive social developments. But we have to say that even so-called left parties, when they were in power, unfortunately also did not contribute to the development, being more democratic, less capital-oriented. And, so Slovenia is a very typical case of post-socialist country where pretty much whoever came into power first took care of the well-being, economic well-being of their acolytes and not for the people, and especially not thinking about what kind of a future we might create. So there have been almost no debates whether the form of capitalism which we adopted is the ultimate form of society we want to live in. There has been no debate, about kind of also using some of the development from the past, from the socialist past, and kind of reincorporating it in the society today. So pretty much we are following in the footsteps of, other European countries who are also kind of, in the situation where, blind technocrats are leading other blind financiers, and there is almost zero democracy, among the people in the kind of leading echelons of power.
But let me just briefly stay a little bit more on this late period of socialism in Slovenia. And I think it was Rastko Močnik who once said that one of the biggest problems from that period is that the most prominent representative of something we might call civil society in Slovenia was immediately after the collapse of socialism incorporated into the state apparatus in different ways, and that's really opened this maybe under-researched, but still important part where Slovenian society in general would go. So whether you think there is something about that, or because you lived that period, you were there, you was participating in different ways from Mladina on so.
Yeah.
So
The concept of civil society, I think, was also criticized well in the time that time, because at first the idea of civil society appeared incredibly progressive as such, and very quickly the debates emerged. But civil society isn't democratic per se. Ku Klux Klan in the United States is civil society. Moral majority groups are civil society. Neo-Nazi groups can be called civil society.
I call them uncivil society.
Yeah, but they are organizations coming from people with their particular ideas. So civil society is not per se democratic or left-leaning. There is a big battle, as Ernesto Laclau has written in many of his books, for the interpretation of what civil society is. So there is a kind of a political battle on the ground, and if some parts of civil society were co-opted in the state machinery, that means that a particular battle was going in one direction and not another.
Basically, yeah, maybe that was oversimplified, or I oversimplified what I had in mind. Because I have been looking the connection between the socialist or late socialist and as well post-socialist period. In one of your works, you claim that for ideology to have an effect, people do not need to identify consciously with that. It is enough that people do not publicly question the regime. So we thought, or at least I think that some of the people thought that at that particular period, questioning of the regime were basically out of the state apparatus in different media, cultural, underground, music scene, and so on and so forth. So I was a little bit more about that. But I would kindly push you a little bit to just stay a bit on that about it is not enough. It is enough that people do not publicly question the regime, either socialist or capitalist or whatsoever.
Yeah, and I think that here we're in exactly the same situation now with the post-industrial capitalism, the idea of choice, precisely not questioning ideology. So, of course, this saying that you don't need to believe, you only need to kneel down and pretend that you are believing was already, part of Pascal's thinking about religion. And, later in socialism, it was Václav Havel who, in his short story about the greengrocer, pointed out that rituals are the most important to sort of keep the regime in power. His idea was that there was a small greengrocer who always, for the 1st of May, was putting the communist flag into the window of his shop. And his idea was, I don't believe in communism, but it doesn't cost me anything if I put the flag. Havel already pointed out that people don't, need to kind of believe in the regime. It's enough if with the rituals they kind of support the regime, and that's precisely what is still sort of going on. Even today, we are not engaging in the critique of ideology, precisely, this post-industrial ideology of choice, self-making, everyone being responsible for him or herself, and so on. Just do it. Positive thinking, all this ideology is here something that cements a particular division, class divisions that exist in society, and particular modes of production that pertain to post-industrial capitalism.
Renata, you have been writing extensively on the notions of democracy, human rights, feminism, and so on, that has been so central to the Western theory, and then how it suddenly lost their established meanings when communism collapsed.
Yeah.
So what I think is important, having in mind that part of this High Noon at Museum is dedicated also to our students of European Regional Masters in Human Rights and Democracy, but not only because of that. I think that this, what you are calling as a concept, when basically human rights maintain the status that something is unquestionable, sacred, and so on and so forth. Basically, when anti-communist forces come into the power in Eastern European context in general, human rights suddenly lost their importance.
Yeah.
So please, would you be just a little bit more, so to say, into that question?
Yes, the discourse of human rights was very important in the 80s. The fight for human rights, especially in socialism, because as you remember, under socialism, only some parts of rights were sort of kind of privileged, were part of the privileged discourse of the government, the ideas of social rights, equality, but not freedom of speech, not the freedom to criticize the dominant ideology. So, in the 80s, the fight for criticism of the Communist Party used the discourse of human rights in a very, very important way. Unfortunately, with the collapse of socialism, we also lost that kind of a discourse. Almost no one speaks about human rights nowadays. It appears like a kind of an ancient discourse. Very rarely mentioned in the speeches of politicians or even in the kind of the public discourse, So I think that, the idea of human rights is sort of worth revisiting. Of course, there have been many theories about, how problematic the concepts of human rights have been throughout the history. I still very much like old work of Claude Lefort, whose idea was that, the concept of human rights historically allowed people to sort of, for the first time, the Enlightenment concept of human rights allowed people to criticize the context out of which they're coming, their social, political context. It is the first moment where we can sort of kind of step outside of our social milieu and look at this milieu in a different way, in a critical way, So with the subject being the Kantian subject who is not totally embedded either in nature or in culture, this subjectivity allows us a certain kind of a distance, reflection, criticism of our milieu, which wasn't possible before. And I think that, here the concept of human rights still has an important strength. So my desire is to sort of kind of revisit it, reconceptualize it, and, of course, use it in the political battles which we will engage in the future.
Of course, I guess as a human rights in their function as a normative imperative beyond politics and law?
Yeah, but also something that, criticizes law as such.
Exactly. Okay. Before we opening the floor for the guests, I think that it would be pity not to ask you something which I find it very important and concerning the very specific Bosnian context. I know that we had discussions day before yesterday and also yesterday a bit of your research in terms of Bosnian refugees living not only in Slovenia but also in St. Louis and so on and so forth. And what I think is important to take into particular account when Bosnian society is in a question is this transgenerational trauma that is happening in a very, very different way. And this transgenerational concept of trauma is something that you have been working in particularly, as I understood, and I learned from your work in the concept of Bosnian refugees. So please, can you introduce us a little bit to that concept as well?
Yeah, even with the refugees we are dealing today, it's interesting how trauma is absolutely not mentioned. Like our newspapers pretty much around Europe, Slovenian included, write about refugees in terms of numbers. Every day we have numbers, today 2,000, tomorrow 2,500, pretty much, we deal with numbers and, we already know from Stalin that, one person is tragedy, a million is a statistic. So here we are kind of dealing with statistic covering up, denying the individual sort of stories, traumas. So basically, when I looked at Bosnian cases, my interest truly was how is trauma conceptualized, especially in the part of the world, where, trauma discourse has not been so present, like we didn't have the kind of the history of psychoanalysis here dealing with trauma. We also, as I mentioned yesterday in the discussion, didn't have a kind of a belief in the power of the words. There was quite a fear of words. People were imprisoned because of speech. So people talking about something, people talking about trauma, this was not present in the kind of broader Yugoslav space as part of the discourse. Of course, this, is not particular problem only for Bosnia. This was problem also in other traumatized countries. Like, for example, if we look at the countries like Vietnam or Cambodia, like people from Cambodia who have been very much traumatized by Khmer Rouge, often didn't have language in their own country to speak about trauma. So psychoanalysts observed that when people immigrated to the West and when they learned another language, it was then in another language that suddenly they slowly started speaking about trauma. Because in their home context, it was almost as if language related to trauma didn't exist, or a kind of a history of questioning traumatic experiences. Now, of course, from psychoanalysis, we know that trauma goes from generation to generation. It might be the third generation where trauma might emerge. Even psychosis, Freud somewhere mentions, might actually emerge in the third generation, not in the second, not in the first. In regard to Holocaust, we see that it is the third generation, which is often in a very particular way revisiting trauma. I teach in faculties of law, and I'm often visiting professor at Cardozo School of Law in New York, which is a part of a Jewish yeshiva university. And, being a lawyer is like really kind of a traumatic profession. Alcoholism, depression, suicides are very high. And, among students already, at least in America. So I often ask my students, like if it's such a shitty profession, okay, you have money, but you kill yourself. So it's like not really very profitable at the end. Why? And if it's so depressing to study law, and happily, I never studied it, so I teach something that I don't really understand, which is good. So, I ask them, why did you come, And, in the past, they would often say, my grandmother was a victim of Holocaust, and now I want to fight for human rights, or I want to put things right, or whatever. Okay, nowadays, they say, I watched television show Law and Order, and I really like how they are dressed and how the lifestyle, and I'm depressed because economic crisis happened and I won't have such a good job. So it's a slight change. So the third generation might, revisit it. And with the Bosnian situation, which I observed in a few days when I visited St. Louis, I also saw that young generation is very much dealing with the trauma that their parents went through. So in the interviews that I made, young people, some of them who actually were too young to remember what happened at the time of the war, they were speaking about trauma in very painful way, while their parents maybe didn't speak about the traumatic experiences. So what young people were saying was that a lot of the times people who escaped the war here, when they moved to another country, they did not want to speak to their children what actually happened in the camps, or about the losses. They thought that by not speaking, they will be able to move on. Now, what often happened, however, was that older generation would start experiencing post-traumatic kind of symptoms just by coincidence, quite often in a somatic way. So strange illnesses would emerge, which they couldn't kind of explain, where medicine had no answer what really happened. Or accidents. What I was quite surprised in St. Louis is also that they have all these kind of fictional spaces of ex-Yugoslavia. So there are a lot of shops or butcher shops or restaurants which are like a replica of ex-Yugoslavia. So you would have like small shops, like small supermarkets, where they would sell things from Yugoslav territories, but a kind of a mixture, beer from Slovenia, and then Karlovac beer, and then Kraš, Bajadera, and whatever. And so there is like this kind of spaces. And in one of these spaces, by coincidence, I met a man who used to be a truck driver, who had quite a good life in the United States. But when I met him, he looked like a kind of a living dead. I don't know, very sad, depressed man of, I would say, maybe 50 years old. So I asked him, what happened to you? And then he said, I had a car accident, a small car accident. And after this accident, I was never able to function anymore. He said he had a psychological breakdown after a simple, small car accident where all the trauma from 20 years past came out. For 20 years, he didn't rationally think about what happened to him at the time of the war. He repressed it. And then the accident triggered the memory. And, unfortunately, it appeared didn't have a possibility to work that through.
In some of this pioneering work we done in 2000s in so-called divided cities, we do research in Mostar and Vukovar as exemplars of divided cities. And that which you have been mentioned, these relations between the parents and children is become a very strong issue. And I think the concept of this sinister silence between the parents and kids, not only refugees, but those who spend time here, and also silencing about the past, were basically very much come out of the research with the children who said that, I'm just basically telling you more or less how things were going. Our parents think we do not know. They think we do not remember, but that's not true. However, they have been silenced, not only by the parents, but also in the schools and every different ways. And I just wanted to make a parallel. This is not only, as you know, of course, the refugee issue or whatsoever, but also those who been through the war and remained here and so on and so forth. Right. So I think these mechanisms are important as well.
Yeah, so I read in St. Louis Times an interview with one woman. She's actually the daughter of the guy who runs the Bosnian newspaper there. I forgot her name, and she mentioned in this interview a very interesting thing. For her, the trauma is related to being a very young girl in, I think, Sarajevo at the time of the war, and her friend, another boy, decided to find some apples for her. One day, he wanted to go to pick some apples at some trees, and he went to pick the apples and was shot by a sniper. And when she learned, this story, she has been hugely traumatized. She sort of kind of forgot it when she came to America, but then, the story re-emerged, in her memory at some point later. And when she was asked by the newspaper about the trauma, she said, I feel 100 years old. I feel that an old woman, and she's a young woman, and she said, and I don't want to constantly remember, but I also don't want to forget. So precisely, the desire, not to remember, but also not to forget is that kind of a deadlock which I noticed. Now, I mentioned the first day in our discussion, the strange tensions that are happening in some families where children got quite a lot of power actually in their hands because they are the only one who speak language. And quite often in the refugee community, not only in Bosnia, I was told by the psychoanalyst there, it happens also in the Iraqi community because they have quite a lot of Iraqi refugees and others in St. Louis, is that children sometimes are, because of this particular power, manipulating their parents. And sometimes in some families, also using sort of this new power to kind of abuse their parents in a particular way. So there are examples where children are becoming new torturers of the families because they understand language and they understand the law. So, sometimes the inner battles in the family are played out that maybe children will accuse the parents of particular abuse, threaten with calling the police if they are not granted money or whatever from the parents. So exactly. In some families, the inner conflict is very, very painful among the refugees. The other important thing for me, at least I wasn't there enough to kind of analyze it more, but my first impression was also that for quite a lot of older people, being in a fairly prosperous country is really, very painful. Actually, in comparing it from what I've seen in Bosnia, my first impression is that for some people, life is kind of worse in a foreign country than it is here, because they have not been able to forget their past, their homeland, and they have not had the chance to integrate in the new society, and are not speaking the language, and are fantasizing about homeland, which is forever lost.
Thank you. I think it's about high time that we open the stage for you, for any of your intervention, questions, comments. Of course, just please wait for Mike for a second, and go ahead directly.
Thank you. It was all fascinating. Thank you so much. And just a few factual nuances. You spoke of the Western Marxists who were so enthusiastic about Yugoslavia, but there was a very specific small group that was held to be fools by everybody. I mean, that was really never as successful. Even worse, people have been much more admired, like Mao Zedong. That was a real cult, but the cult of Yugoslavia was pretty insignificant.
Praxis.
Yeah. Pretty insignificant. Yeah. But it's just, well, yeah.
Yeah.
But, the usual mistake, has been made about Yugoslavia, like about China, about Soviet Union, the same thing. But then something much more important. I'm very glad that you quoted that famous Václav Havel parable. Because you see, he says that the greengrocer, the private greengrocer, makes this compromise in putting the proletarians of all countries unite in his shop window. The problem is that in the Socialist Republic of Czechoslovakia has not been one single private greengrocer. And it has been the vegetable commerce state company, which of course has decorated the shops themselves without asking anybody. So the problem is totally 100% false. Like so many other things that the late President Havel has written, God rest his soul. But it's very characteristic that he should have this myth. And this has something to do with the idea of civil society, which is my real objective here. Namely, we have a very peculiar idea of civil society in the whole of Eastern Europe, the whole of ex-socialist, ex-something societies. Because you see, if you look at the most classical theory of civil society in Hegel, what do belong to civil society? Well, all voluntary associations, including political parties, that is intuitively absolutely excluded from this notion in Eastern Europe, the market, the Öffentlichkeit, and everything where legitimate coercion doesn't take place. So this is something between the family and the state. Now, so why did it become such a foundational myth of the new societies in Eastern Europe? I find this fascinating, and some of what you were saying is very illuminating regarding that. But it's very interesting that because politics is judged by the majority of the public opinion, by the establishment, as being the terrain of coercion and of obligation and of duty. So this is why human rights have appeared as the strategy of opposition, because where right and self-activity and something propelled from people's individual moral will that has nothing to do with politics. But of course, that's the view of dictatorship, and which we have internalized in a way while resisting it and while hating it very much. But still, this myth of civil society remained with us, as it would be a dichotomy between the evil world of obligation, law, the big other sort of symbolic order, and us, who are, of course, steered and directed only by our moral will that is bound to remain forever individual and forever voluntary and of ever bereft of the hope of ever changing the political order. So I think that one of this both a symptom and the cause of our problems here. I could continue, but of course,
Thank you.
I won't.
Yeah, no, thank you very much for your intervention, and I agree with you that Václav Havel created a fantastic myth, which I think was probably created very much for the Western eyes, you know, so the myth that the West wanted to see, he kind of guessed. One of the most important theorists of Czechoslovakia for me was Milan Šimečka. His book, The Restoration of Order, I think very much analyzes, I don't know if you read it, it was published in the early 90s by Verso Books, very much analyzed the inner tension already inside of the society, and you know what you already mentioned, kind of the distrust in politics and kind of the retreat into the private sphere, which you know is still very much present in the post-socialist times, the distrust in politics, the feeling that politicians are per se, you know, corrupt. Politics is something not to engage with for the normal people. It is better to oppose it in the civil society kind of still parts. You know, even today in Slovenia, we have, you know, the emergence of kind of the civil society, but mostly on the right. You know, the civil society now is protecting again the private sphere, the sphere that, you know, again, where, you know, we would have marriage only among heterosexuals, where we will protect children and so on. So not much has changed in regard to this distrust of politics, and also, you know, a kind of a unwillingness of people to engage in political battles. That, unfortunately, I think still remains as a remnant of the distrust that existed in the socialist times.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and clarification's sake, of course, immediately is that maybe we were not quite precisely, but when I was insisting on this Western Marxist, and when Renata was speaking, we were mostly talking about her work on Praxis School and Korčula and so on and so forth. Sinan, please.
Thank you very much. Just short story, maybe I can want to say. One time in New York, I saw one beggar, one homeless, in Tube, in Metro. He said, I know that I'm guilty for my situation, but please give me some money. Here, I saw a lot of beggars, but everybody of them say, I'm not guilty at all for my situation. Everybody is guilty. I have good intention, but you know, the system and the law, everybody is against me, so I'm a victim of the all kind of forces against my destiny. So please give me the money. So can we say that it's two opposite sides? But you know, for me it is very interesting now how we can have choice against this kind of rational choice. So what you propose to have like a good choice? Because I think in a modern time nobody don't make in consideration this Sartre, what he said about young men, should I go in the army or should I stay with my mom to protect her? So this, which kind of decision we can make? Or shall we make decision against decision or against rational choice? Or what is proposal, what is the choice to fight against this kind of rational choice which you are criticizing?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, about your first comment, that's really interesting. The different, you know, settings about of the sort of beggars, and I can, you know, give you another example in this direction. Just yesterday in The Guardian, there was an article written by the sales person from Walmart in the United States. Yesterday was Black Friday, you know, kind of the holiday of consumerism. And at the same time, in the United States, they were celebrating these days Thanksgiving, which is their biggest family holiday. So a woman working on Thanksgiving Day in Walmart for $9, a little bit more per hour, writes the text saying that I'm working the whole day during Black Friday and I'm selling things in Walmart which I cannot buy because I'm so underpaid. And, you know, my family is eating dinner without me, and so on. And the comments were incredible. More than half comments claimed, you made the choice to work in Walmart. Why didn't you get educated, find a better job, and then you would have been paid more, because the woman claims that she's part of the movement of workers who want now at least $15 per hour, and they are going to demonstrate and so on. And the family which owns Walmart now owns like 46% of whatever, everything of the capital. I don't know exactly where, but somewhere. Now, in retail, yeah. So the woman pretty much, makes a political statement that they are going to organize themselves as workers, and people make pretty much statements about choice. It was your choice. And then some people kind of supporting her say, yeah, but maybe the woman didn't really have a choice. What about if she lives in a small town where the only possible job is in Walmart? And then other women, people supporting her said, what about, if we look that even education today doesn't really open you the doors to, more choices and better life. And then still others say, oh, what about us shoppers who come to Walmart? We also can't buy everything we want. And there are other salespeople who work, for example, in Mercedes shop, and they can't buy a Mercedes for themselves. So that's life, that's life choices. You make you earn what kind of choices you made. So I think what surprised me was how present precisely this ideology was, and how the political statement of this particular woman was completely pushed aside about the demonstrations they are preparing and so on. About the choices, yeah. My idea is that we shouldn't take choices too seriously, in terms of that we can make a rational choice and also figure out what will be the result of our choices. And that basically there are many situations where truly we don't have choices. And actually more and more people, don't have that many choices. It very much depends on our social settings in regard to what kind of choices will be in our lives, whether we will have the possibility to get education, what's the milieu in which we were raised in the family, what was the economic status of our family, what's the political situation in our country, and so on. So there are kind of limited spaces where truly we can make, some kind of rational choices. And from psychoanalytic point of view, of course, we know that a lot of our choices are very much linked to the unconscious mechanisms, or, the kind of the things which we rationally do not control. I am not against the idea of choice, because in the political situation, we have to involve the idea of choice, freedom, even if they are fantasies. Because nonetheless, democracy relies on the idea of choice. Elections, they are problematic, but nonetheless, there are moments, of choice where, we can think about broader issues, the social kind of dimensions of choice, which, as I mentioned, in this ideology of choice today are usually totally pushed aside. And, what I observe on the individual level is, of course, a lot of people coming nowadays, with a kind of the list of the right choices maybe they have done. My friend Susie Orbach, psychoanalyst in London, had told me about a patient who came to her with the list of perfect choices she had done. She went to the best school, found great job, married a nice guy, bought her apartment, and then she kind of calculated and said, where is happiness?
I'm not happy.
I'm totally dissatisfied, and I have done all the right choices. And, Susie said that, the first thing they had to do in psychoanalysis was actually sort of undermine this idea of choice, and, realize that most of her choices actually were done in regard to what she perceived as socially proper choice. Studying something that maybe brings good job, and so on. And of course, not dealing with the kind of intricate dynamic of her desire, which is of course the unconscious desire, where basically often rationally, actually, we don't know, what we desire. And when we get it, we don't desire it anymore.
Say something before I go back to school. And yes, we go to school on Saturdays. You mentioned choice, and I think that for a reason, choice and chance are very similar words, which means that what we choose in life demands a certain kind of chance in life. So if we choose to go one way, we will have different chances on that path. And in this kind of society, it is important for everyone to choose differently. Because if we had a society in which everyone choose the best choices, we wouldn't really have a functional society. It is very important for a society to be layered. For example, you mentioned a woman working in Walmart. We need someone working in Walmart. This is a position without which we can't have a society. We can't go in a grocery shop without anyone working there. So this is a position that needs to be taken by someone who just made those choices, and that's their chance in life. They need to work that way. They have this payment. When in reality, people don't like their jobs, their positions, mainly because the amount of income they have. So in this society, which I think that is a functional one, I think that chances don't always need to be these best chances out there. So everyone has their own chances that make them, that push them to where they are today. So we have, of course, in one society, no one can be. This is the reality. We can't have a society in which everyone is rich, in which everyone is satisfied. This is not a functional society. For example, in a socialist society, this is ideal. And this society was working because everyone kind of had the same amount of things. So everyone was allowed to have everything they needed for functional life. But this society just was crushed. It doesn't exist today. This society didn't continue to exist because people said, I want to choose more, or I want to choose less. I want something else other than this choice you gave me. So today, we have this capitalistic, well, they call this a democracy, but it's a farce. Like there was never such thing as real communism. There was never such thing as real anything to me, because at the end there's always just one person that wants to control everything else. But I want to go back to the society. Okay, I will. So in this society, choices are what we need. So we all need to choose in life, but that doesn't mean that everyone is going to be satisfied with what they chose.
Thank you. Before you, Renata, please, and we'll collect some other questions. I think that this is a great moment to maybe another, for me, very interesting quote from your book about choice, just to put it a little bit there, and then we will get a question about this particular thing. Look at this, I'm quoting. One of the greatest gains of the capitalism is that even proletariat slave feels like a master. He or she believes that he or she has the power to change his life. We are propelled by the ideology of the self-made man. We work more, we consume more, and in the end we consume ourselves. End of the quote. Please, question.
Okay, well, I also have a question about choice, but maybe from a different perspective, from the consumer. So I was wondering what you think about this idea of what we can call socially conscious choice. So something like buying fair trade coffee, or not going to, I don't know, the Gap because they produce in third world countries with child labor. And it's something that I know a lot of people in the West who take this very, very seriously, you could say almost religiously. And I was wondering if you think that there is any kind of positive potential in this idea, or do you see it just as another symptom of, you know, this fake ideology of choice?
Yeah, thank you. Yes, with the first speaker, we probably don't share kind of the same thinking about the opportunities for people to make choices. I still think that, you know, there are very limited possibilities for people in regard to, you know, what kind of a class they are coming from. And I did in the book analyze, you know, the ideology that happened in the 70s, where a certain Darwinian thought kind of re-emerged, which, for example, in the manuals for business people started speaking about survival of the fittest, you know, because the question for quite some time in capitalism was whether everyone can make it. There was even a moment where the question was related to religious question, whether there is a space for everyone in heaven, or some people need to go to hell, and because there are limited spaces in heaven. So there were times where the idea was that heaven is infinite, that everyone can make it, and then there was a change, no, only some can come to heaven. So similar debate was in regard to whether everyone can make it. And in the 70s, more and more the ideology emerged that only the fittest survive. So some have to die, some have to be ruined, some have to be poor, so that some small, you know, elite of the best and so on can thrive. And, you know, this ideology introduced a very interesting new discourse of violence. You know, you have to kill your opposition, you know, you have to get rid of your competitors and so on, which still pertains, you know, this idea of, you know, that only one can make it, you know, even in the offices, only one can get promotion, you know, the survival of the fittest and so on in the economy is still very much part of that kind of a cruelty, which I think is now part of the discourse, underneath the discourse of choice. And a new, you know, part of cruelty. Yesterday, in the debate between Željka and Jasna, there was really interesting moment when they mentioned, you know, the new narcissism and, you know, the idea that nowadays, you know, the space in the higher echelons of society, in politics and in corporations, is really kind of propagating the narcissistic personality. I would even say that not only narcissistic personality, but kind of people with untriggered psychosis, people who can be cruel, who don't have feelings of guilt, who can fire people, you know, who can climb the ladder of success by getting rid of their compatriots without any feelings of guilt. I don't know if you saw the film Up in the Air, where George Clooney is hired to fire people. You know, that's kind of the society where we are, you know, living. The second part, you know, about chance, yeah, I think that's really important. The chance idea is really interesting. It's sort of almost pushed the idea of chance outside of the loop when we are speaking about choices. And rational choices often don't speak about kind of the power of chance, which is very much linked much more to kind of the something that you can't calculate, you know, unpredictable and so on. And just as a short intermezzo, 2 years ago, Bernard Harcourt, who was at that time professor at University of Chicago, and I did a little thing on chance, and we decided we had, you know, the whole event was about the power of chance and choice, and before giving our separate papers, we decided that we will mix our papers, that he will read like a paragraph of his paper, I will read a paragraph of mine. We didn't know each other's papers. So we did it. We told our audience, what you will hear now is a total chance event. You know, we didn't prepare joint paper, but we are giving you a chance, you know, outcome. So we do this performance. You won't believe that our audience didn't believe us that it was a chance. They thought that we wrote the paper together and that we just kind of joked that this is a chance, you know. So you can see that when you're speaking from the position of the authority, you know, for example, you have an enormous power, you know, and people don't believe you that something is chance. They still think that it was a matter of choice. About the ethical choices, this is a very complicated thing. Yes, often we feel great if we make ethical choices, don't buy in shops which mistreat people and so on. unfortunate results of this have been often that, you know, people in the third world countries lost jobs because Levi's, for example, decided not to produce them anymore in some countries in South America where they were mistreating the labor. So there have been, you know, kind of side effects of this ethical stance for people, you know, which unfortunately were kind of, you know, devastating for them. Although no one wants to have child labor, but nonetheless in the villages when they lost all possibilities of labor, you know, that was, you know, quite shocking even for the proponents, you know, of not buying in Levi's. And then the second important thing is that a lot of the time now we have corporations who are playing with this idea of ethical. You know, like, I can't stand Starbucks. You know, like, not only that they have overpriced coffees and not terribly good quality coffee, but like all this ethical discourse, you know, our coffee has been bought in, you know, from these poor workers, wherever, you know, and we are contributing to other poor farmers and so on. And so it's kind of part of this new ideology which corporations are using. And of course, corporations are also very well equipped, for example, to use the greenwash to present themselves as, you know, very ecological, while, you know, they're doing exactly the opposite. Like BP in Britain renamed themselves into Beyond Petroleum, and they have decided to put, you know, the kind of the panels on the roofs of their offices so that they are collecting, you know, the solar energy because they want to be super ecological. But of course, you know, they are ruining the earth endlessly with their, you know, petroleum business.
Renata, thank you very much.
Thank you.
So please.